My name is Melissa Killeleagh. I am your host of the Melissa Killeleagh Show. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with my show, I love to bring people into the studio who are living their lives with passion and purpose, and to really focus on sharing stories of people and events and ideas that, just bring positivity to the world. We can all turn on the TV at any given point in time and hear the same stories over and over. And one of the ideas that I'm really focused on in this life is the idea that our lives are exactly what we're willing to put between our two ears, right? We do a lot of work exercising and getting fit, but we don't do the inner work and the inner sizing that it takes to really truly live a good life. And so when I can bring people in here and showcase these stories and talk about values-driven living and people who are living in alignment with their core values, it's so powerful to me, and I hope to all of you, to be inspired to do the same in your own life. So for those of you who don't know my background, what's interesting today is, although I did not get to work with the person I'll be interviewing, he is coming from Seneca County, and that's where I most recently retired myself from when it comes to the 9 to 5. I am what I love to call a mompreneur, so balancing the busyness of being mom and running a business from my phone or wherever I am, sometimes the playground. And really reserving time for the commitments to my community, for this podcast, for volunteer work, for doing the things that I truly love in the world. So without further ado, today's guest is Christopher Folk, and he's going to be sharing with us a little bit more about his story. He is the Seneca County Court Attorney and currently a candidate for district attorney for our county as well. So what I'd love to do is introduce you to him today. So Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So glad to have the time to share with you. And so Chris is actually going to start by just giving us a little bit about the background that has brought him to today. So Chris,
thank you.
What brings you here?
Well, interesting question. So it's somewhat circuitous fashion to arrive at where I am currently. So going back a little bit, I'm actually from Seneca County originally, grew up in the southern end of the county, graduated from South Seneca, thereafter attended Cornell University, and while there also was in the Marine Corps. So I did some time there, and then after that I spent a little bit of time on the West Coast, a brief period, if you will, where I met my current wife, Tiffany. We relocated.
Fantastic.
Yes, it was kind of an interesting experience. She was from Massachusetts. I obviously was from New York. We actually met in California. Subsequently relocated back to Massachusetts, where she was from. And then we came to a point in our lives where we determined that in order to raise a family, it made sense to have roots in a stable, viable community. And naturally, we were drawn back to upstate New York, the Finger Lakes region, and we relocated at that time back to Ovid. And we spent a few years in Ovid before relocating ultimately up to the northern end of the county, and we settled in Waterloo. We've been in Waterloo since 2006. And there we've raised our children. Our oldest, 25, is a United States Marine. Our second child, Tristan, was 18 at the time of his death in 2017. And then our two daughters, Trinity and Callista, are 18 and 17. Trinity's attending FLCC in her first semester, and Callista's a senior in high school at Waterloo. So that kind of shows, geographically how I am where I am now. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a bit of a longer discussion to try to determine how I came here from a professional basis. Right. So a background, a little bit, like I said, a little bit of time in the Marines. Also, I spent time in the high-tech industry, roughly 20 years leading and managing teams in the high-tech arena for a company based out of Boston, Hopkinton area, Massachusetts. I worked remotely here since moving back to New York in 2004. And there came a time when it made sense for me to go back and attain another degree. So I've got a bachelor's, a master's. I'm also underway of an MBA, 12 credits shy of an MBA from Northeastern. And then I completed my law degree at Syracuse University. And while I was undertaking the law degree and also working remotely during those intervening years, I also was elected to town justice in Waterloo in November of 2011. And I took office in 2012, and I presided over thousands of cases in those 7 years. I stayed as town justice until October of 2018, when I resigned to join the district attorney's office. And then following DA Porsche's election as judge, I moved with him in January over to the Seneca County Court, where I've served as court attorney. So that's kind of, high-level professional overview of where I am, how I got to where I am today. And obviously there's more intersecting areas there you might want to broach further.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things I find most interesting is we just met for the first time in person today, and I could wager that I have learned quite a bit about some of the values that may drive you just based on all of those different paths and twists and turns in life. Everything from the value of the power of daily discipline that comes from being a Marine, and the value for learning and growing and continued education, the value for family and community based on the choice to come back here. It's always that interesting distinction that we have to make between North and South County. This makes me laugh.
Indeed.
Yes. But what I also can see is that professionally and personally, you're in this time frame right now where, your youngest are either out of the house or preparing to be out of the house.
Certainly.
And so as you are, facing this election, quite an opportunity for some shifts, right? In terms of focus and energy and time and commitment. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about the values that are really driving the work that you do right now.
Certainly. So, probably the overarching value that I found, and one of the most telling reasons why we actually moved back here from Massachusetts, is really the sense of community, the sense of involvement, the sense that people are really enmeshed within one another's lives. It's a intertwining of values and ideals coming together to form a single cohesive community. And I think there's a very, you mentioned the North and South, and obviously North County and South County, there's some disparities there, there's some differences, but overall Seneca County is very holistic and has really come together with a very strong sense of community. And that's one of the driving factors that compelled us to come back here to raise a family, because we really wanted to instill those values in our family. Because ultimately, it's not about just what you bring to the table, but it's about what those around you bring to the table, and how collectively that creates something greater than the sum of its parts. So, very symbiotic relationship between all those moving pieces. And, you look at, economically, financially, it can be somewhat difficult to live in upstate New York. But when you balance that against, the effects and then the change that you can bring to your family and to others, it really is, it's a balance, I think, that's been struck. It's delicate, but I believe it is in the favor of the community and being within the community. It makes such a tremendous difference. I mean, for instance, following the rather untimely passing of our son Tristan, who died by suicide in December 2017, just a huge outpouring of support. And, when we look back at that, retrospectively, we realized that had we migrated to a larger city, had we stayed in California or gone to Western Massachusetts or Eastern Massachusetts, that outpouring support was unlikely to have been received by us during those very difficult and trying times. And that was really when we redoubled our efforts and decided, it's important to not just be in the community, but to be part of it and to be a contributing member to bring something back to others. And that was just a huge message for us, realizing that, such a difficult thing to undergo, such a tragic event, had it not been for the outpouring of support from others, I don't think I'd probably be here today discussing these issues with you. It just probably wouldn't have come to fruition.
Yeah.
So it was huge for us and for our family, and we really want to give back. So some of the values I want to give is to be able to give back and to have somewhat of a legacy going forward, so that you can show, me as an individual is largely immaterial. I don't bring a lot to the table, but I think what I can do is connect people to bring messaging so that conversations can ensue, so that discussions can happen, so that change can be undertaken and the overall community can be enhanced.
Yeah, I love that. The description that you use that I think is most powerful is this concept of being so deeply enmeshed, right, in each other's lives, that sense of creating community because of that connection, that social fabric. And I talk about this a lot because having shared that similar short-term stint in California, the feeling of everything just being so transient was always at the forefront. And, I compare the amount of time that I spent out there to, when I first moved to this community, and the difference in how deeply enmeshed I became here so quickly. To gain the trust and the support of, my community out in California. I was working within the San Francisco Unified School District, the Housing Authority, the State University, and these, old sort of entrenched institutions that were already separate to begin with. I didn't have that. Right. And I see that for so many people. And there is a beautiful role to be played when someone like yourself or myself, I consider that to also be my work here, which is the connector piece, right? I think, and Josh might remember this, but on one episode, I talked about this idea that, the metaphor of twinkle lights at Christmas time. One individual light is not going to be very impactful, but when you have that entire strand lit, it's beautiful and it creates something very magical. And so the work that I feel like I get to do in the world, and even through this podcast, is sort of creating constellations, right? Like seeing people for their individual gifts and then bringing them together to create something even more powerful. So thank you for touching on that. It's a really beautiful description. Going back to your sharing a little bit about the experience of your son passing, I'm grateful that you were willing to share that story with me earlier today, and I can't even begin to understand the sorrow that comes with that. But what I find to be so powerful is your ability to share the story, but also the willingness to be vulnerable on behalf of others, right? On behalf of your son, on behalf of your own family, but also on behalf of others, because that's really who that's helping, is all of the other people out there who, don't necessarily talk about or bring to the forefront a topic like suicide.
Certainly.
And so, I'd love for you to share, as tender as it may be, a little bit more about how that drives you and how that moves you in your work in the world.
Well, as my wife and I and the children have said, and we'll say over and over, this is not a journey we would have willingly undertaken, but it's one that we find ourselves on, a path, if you will, that has been circumscribed for us. Mm-hmm. And having been placed on that path, we felt, there was two options. We could either stand still and do nothing, or we could move forward. And make no mistake, in the intervening days following the death of Tristan and, their brother and our son, it would have been far easier to stay within our dwelling, to block out the outside world, to withdraw, to be disconnected, and just kind of live with our own grief and despair. But, we realized, there's a couple things we realized. One, we realized that Tristan was a very unique individual, a very giving, very wise, highly intellectual, extremely gifted individual. And one for which we were not able to ascertain any of the traditional warning signs that might traditionally be exhibited in someone that has suicidal tendencies or ideations. And knowing that, we decided that the impetus was on us to try to send that message out, to let people know that, if this could happen to Tristan, if this could happen to us, then it could happen to anyone. I mean, the fragility of life and all the connotations therein. It's such a interesting paradigm to think how easily life can be taken, how easily life can be lost, and yet we continue to look towards the future and towards other events instead of living in the moment, while being, of course, cognizant of the future and goals that we might have. So we really, we made the decision that we were going to, tell our story. We started, right with the obituary, the celebration of life, the memorial service. we were very clear on what had transpired with Tristan and how Tristan left this world. And we felt that was important. It wasn't an easy message to deliver, but we felt it was important for people to understand that there were signs that we didn't see, maybe signs that weren't manifest, that weren't exhibited, but that it is important for people to be connected, to people to ask the questions, people have the conversations to say, are you okay? Are you doing okay? And not just to ask, but to really take the time to listen to an actual answer that came from somewhere deep rather than just a casual conversation that might ensue as two people are passing by, if you will. So we really decided that it was important, and we knew that we were kind of uniquely positioned because of our status in the community, because of our role in the community, because of the people and the connections we had made prior, different politicians, different players. We knew that this was a message we could convey to a greater circle than perhaps someone else that had suffered the same tragedy. So we felt it was necessary for us to move forward and to do that, and to do that hard thing, and to be able to project that message, to be able to tell people what had happened, so that the conversation could take place to try to break down that stigma, which is, looking back and looking, in the research we've done, obviously we're just lay people, and we had no background in mental health, no issues there, no salient understanding or any points prior to this incident. But we've since undertaken a bit of research and tried to become enmeshed in that, try to understand what's going on there. And we've reached out to various persons. And we found that, some of these signs exhibit, some of them don't, some of them manifest, some of them aren't. There is a certain percentage of these cases where there is no mental illness that's forthcoming. There it's known that can be ascertained. So we felt it was important to put that out there, in realizing that that this is a growing epidemic and the numbers are rising, and 47,000 people died by suicide in the U.S. in 2017, and it's just staggering to think about that, and to think about all these lives that are impacted. And you think about just in a small community like this, the passing of Tristan, I mean, obviously his immediate family, us, and then, going out and, students at school and people he knew, connections he made, and all of this is connected. And as you go out further and further and have more discussions, you realize that you can go almost anywhere and find someone that's been impacted by a tragic death such as this. And in a lot of cases, they never had the opportunity to expound on that or to talk about it, or it was just something that they kind of put on the back burner and compartmentalized and didn't discuss openly. So we just felt it was important to have that conversation, to get that out there, to reach out to our representatives, to try to go to Washington to affect change, to try to go to Albany, which we've done. Anything we could do to try to help elevate the conversation and try to make a positive, lasting difference.
Yes. So, again, I come back to all the values that guide us through these moments, like thinking back to the moments early on that your family had to make the decisions, to choose to do the things that would have been just as easy not to do, right? Goes back to those daily disciplines, valuing that choice, right? We can choose to stay home, we can choose to withdraw, or we can choose to step out into the world and accept that we've been given this message to deliver. The choice of presence, right? Because it takes remaining very present in the moment to stay resilient with those kinds of emotions, while also sharing that level of vulnerability. And then ultimately that value that you just talked about, which is the transparency of it all. And I have to imagine, Christopher, that these values also impact your platform and where you're heading in the work that you aspire to do. Certainly. In the district attorney's office. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think some of that goes back even to when I was first elected as town justice. So I undertook that job, and I tried to be very serious about, going into that role and understanding what it meant to serve in that role and to give back to the community. And I think I approached that from a perspective of honesty, integrity, ethics, professionalism, and being fair and impartial, which is fair and impartial obviously doesn't apply particularly well on the prosecutorial side. But certainly there's aspects that touch that. And I think one of the things there is trying to understand not simply why X has happened, but how A, B through Y brought you to that point, how all those events transpired and how all that culminated in where a person is presently. And I think in some of those cases, you look at, there's so much prosecutorial discretion, and you can say, look, you have violated this penal law, therefore you are subject to a year incarceration, 10 years, whatever the case may be, shock probation, and you have a number of potential outcomes. But when you take a step back and look, all right, so first of all, what's the impact of the community? Because first and foremost, we have to evaluate that. How is the community being impacted? Is it negative? Is it mildly impartial? Or is there potential for a positive impact through further change? When you look at that, you can say, what makes the most sense in a particular case? Doing it a case-by-case basis is obviously more resource intensive, but I think you can streamline some of those processes where you can look at, you can say, how did we get to where we are currently? And I think when you look at it from, fairness and impartiality, and you take some of that mindset to apply to the role of the prosecutor, and their primary role really is the truth-seeking function and justice. So when you want to ascertain the truth to figure out exactly what happened, why we are where we are, everything that culminated in that. And then you also want to say, what can I do to make a positive impact on the community? So, you want to look at the safety and security of the community, but if there's something that doesn't affect that directly, or it's a minimal, negligible effect, then there's other ways that you can pursue justice, if you will. So, some of the things there are, you can still be a prosecutor and be compassionate, but you have to look holistically. So you can't look merely at a single sphere of influence. You can't look purely at the defendant. You can't look purely at the victim. And you can't look purely at the community. You've got to take all of those together, because those are all comprised of really the same values, because you want to overall enhance the community itself. So when you take all that together and you look at those, you can apply different paradigms to certain cases to understand how you'd want to take that to fruition, whether you'd want to take it to trial, whether you want to plea bargain, or whether you want to have different avenues that justice could be sought. So some of the things there are, for instance, drug court, mental health court, potential for veterans court. When you look at people and the circumstances they find themselves in, and you take a step back and look everything that led up to that, then you can develop a better plan, because ultimately what we want to do is not merely be retributive and punish people per se. We want to make sure that we're doing something beneficial for the community. So if a certain person has committed crime X, if there's a way to rehabilitate them, to reintegrate them into society, into the community, so they can be contributing members of the community, we want to do that. And we want to do that in a way to minimize taxpayer expense and maximize the community, its overall effectiveness. So you kind of balance all those things together. There's a lot of moving pieces, obviously, but you have to take a more holistic approach and look at the big picture. And you have to understand how those pieces fit together. And I think that's where it's important to be compassionate, but in general, to the community, to the victims, and to the defendants. And you have to also have strong leadership style. And I think you have to have a strong backbone, because the prosecutor's in a rather unusual predicament, if you will. A defense attorney could get an acquittal, and the defendant will be very pleased with that. The community will be upset, but they'll be upset with the prosecution, not with the defense attorney. Whereas the prosecution, even if you apply compassion, you may say, well, you know what, this X transpired, defendant A did this, so this is what we're going to seek as far as a term of either incarceration or rehabilitation. The defendant is going to view that as retributive, whereas the victim may feel that that's, it doesn't make sense, it's not logical based on the crime that was undertaken, and the victim's family too. And you have all these ancillary players that are going to view this from a different perspective. Right. So the role of the prosecutor is really to always be underwhelming to the general public, because the general public is not going to really understand what's happening. And there's always going to be parties that think that something's too harsh, something's too lenient, or that the prosecutor simply isn't doing their job. But as long as the prosecutor is focused on the overall safety and security of the community and ensuring that that happens, and that's their fundamental focus, then I think that's ultimately how they can be successful, and they can adapt the leadership style that allows them to do that, to bring the necessary people, the necessary resources to be able to implement that change and be able to look and say, this is where the community was 4 years ago, and this is where we are now, and this is where we're going, for instance. So I think you have to look, long-term positive change, and you have to always look at the truth-seeking function and justice, and you have to apply it fairly and effectively to a number of people and scenarios.
Absolutely. In all of that, I find my mind sort of pulling towards some of the changes that are on the horizon when it comes to how we view defendants, right? Some of the legislation that has come out. I think, what is the term for next year? We'll be calling them principles, correct? So I'd love to know how that impacts your work and just some of your thoughts and feelings on these changes.
Well, there's a number of wide-ranging impacts there, and it goes all the way from bail reform to discovery reform to the way we view or label persons of interest, defendants, principals, if you will, whatever label we're applying to them. And you need a strong level of acumen, I believe, with respect to technology when you look at that. Because what you're going to find is that, look at the discovery, for instance, the issuance of appearance tickets, the fact that those have to be returnable within 20 days, the fact that open file discovery has to take place, which already was. But you look at all these underlying things. So, something as simple as an officer interviewing a person of interest may take notes. The fact that those notes exist, that knowledge is imputed to the prosecution as soon as those hit the paper. And those are all subject to be turned over. Additionally, any witness statements, addresses of any witnesses or any potential witness, or anyone with any information whatsoever with respect to the crime or the alleged crimes, and the ability of defendants to go and re-enter and revisit the scene of the crime. All of this is very defense-centric. And a number of these reforms, I'm all for open discovery. Having done some defense work and also prosecution work, one of the things I did in my short tenure at the DA's office was to enable some of the file sharing features that currently exist within the software the DA's office uses to be able to have discovery where it's all electronically scanned, it's available, and it's provided to defense attorneys. And there's the ability to track that, determine, when they received it, if they received it, and what exactly was in those files. So technology really is at the core of this, and being deadline driven. And having run multi-million-dollar projects in the tech industry, and having been involved in extremely tight, stringent deadlines, both in tech as well as government work, you realize you work backwards from a point in time in order to make sure that all these things are accomplished.
Reverse engineer it.
Exactly. Yeah. And the downside there is if something's missed in a discovery, in the part of the discovery reform, for instance, something isn't turned over, evidence could be excluded, a case could be dismissed. The consequences could be dire, both for the community as well as for the victim, and certainly for the prosecution side. It could be significant deleterious effects that are seen by a failure to adhere to strict deadline-driven timelines. And that's where I think someone that has both a perspective in tech as well as doing deadline-driven work will really be of paramount importance in the district attorney's office. Being able to understand how that works, being able to implement those changes, being able to know what it means to be a paperless office, what it means to be tech-driven, what it means to be able to have access to files and information on the fly, regardless of where you are, which let's be honest, the typical lawyer is not very tech savvy. That's the world we live in. Oftentimes lawyers are a little bit behind the curve when it comes to technology. And the prosecution office can't afford to be behind the curve in technology when these things roll out January 1. Right. It's going to be critical that they have a full, complete, and fair understanding of how that works and how to be able to implement those changes that are going to be necessary to successful prosecutions.
So interesting. And yes, I do know all about the attorneys being behind when it comes to technology, because I was the one who received the bills from the county attorney's office when I was at DHS. So what I find fascinating is you've had a lot of different influences in terms of background, discipline. Talk to us about some of the influences that you've had personally. Who have some of your mentors been? Who has really had a profound impact on your life when it comes to coaches, mentors, teachers, that sort of thing?
Well, kind of an interesting answer, and it's I would say it's somewhat atypical, but probably one of the mentors, unbeknownst to himself and unbeknownst to myself until after the fact, would have been my son Tristan. So, all my children are absolutely exceptional in almost every respect. Christopher's a Marine. He served overseas. He served in Afghanistan, multiple tours, multiple deployments. Just exceptional, giving, selfless people. The girls are both very selfless, very giving. And it's somewhat unusual for a parent to be on the receiving end of mentorship from a child. But I think, as I look back and, I look at, the various people I've worked with, engineers. I mean, when I worked at EMC, I worked with some rocket scientists that helped put the first craft on the moon. Some of these people are very intellectual, very gifted. But when you take a step back and you look at the innocence of youth and you try to look through their lens on society and on the world, I think you have some very profound insights. I mean, you look at, it's just amazing. And, Tristan, having reached the rank of Eagle Scout, having gone through the application process to the service academies, he was always just a very altruistic individual, and certainly that didn't come from me. That's most likely all from his mother. But I've learned a number of insights from that, and also, too, obviously from his mother, who, as you may have heard, is actually in the process of donating one of her kidneys to someone that she didn't know prior to the donation process. So that's kind of, what my family brings to the table, and I'm trying to take some of that selflessness and apply it to my own life. And I think in so doing, I'm seeing things through a very different lens. I'm understanding what it really means to not only be present, but to be involved and to put the needs of others above self. And those are probably the key lessons I've learned in life. And some of those lessons were only learned through tragic circumstances, but they're lessons nonetheless. And I think they're important takeaways to understand. As individuals, we're largely insignificant in so many respects, but we have the ability to make profound impacts on people, and we may never even know how profound that impact was or what it meant. Little things that can have a ripple effect across the spectrum.
Absolutely.
So I think that's one of my takeaways, and that's kind of the value I've gotten that I'm trying to bring to the table, is to be able to make these small changes. Look, I'm running for DA, and I'm hoping I win, and I'd like to be in that role for 4 years. But I'm on to other things, so I know there's only so much change I can impact in 4 years, or hopefully it's just 4 years. Maybe I'll do another term. I think just looking at one term now, but then I want to do other things. I want to reach other people. I want to be able to implement more changes, and I want to also ensure that there's some legacy and some continuity, and not simply a vacuum that I leave in my wake. So I want to make sure, both for the community, for the office, and for everyone I touch, that there is some of that in place.
So I want to talk about that in a few moments, that concept, legacy. It's one that I love to explore. But before that, one of the things that I can't help but bring up that I find to be fascinating is when you talk about Tristan being a mentor to you, the one thing that's striking to me about our youth versus having the wisdom from experience, right? When we have wisdom and insight when we're young, we're still in this place, Christopher, that I feel like I've spent a journey coming back to, which is a place where we're able to live life from the inside out rather than the outside in. And what I mean by that is, through the course of our lives, as we mature, we have so many different influences upon us, whether it's our parents, it's church, it's society, it's, the whole institution of education. There's sort of this known expectation of what the course of our life is supposed to look like. And yet, if we are true to ourselves and we focus on creating a life that feels good from the inside and doesn't just look good from the outside, there's something really powerful and valuable there. And I can imagine, without never having met Tristan, that is probably something he was able to give, is that sense of what life feels like from the inside out, right? To pass that wisdom on. And you and I had a great conversation, while we were at Cafe 19 earlier today, about how this also impacts social media, right? So many people on social media are out there, comparing themselves to other people's highlight reels, and I shared my, deep desire to have people really start sharing that deep, authentic human experience, which isn't just the good stuff. It's not just the highlights. It's everything in between. It's the building. It's the hike up the mountain, before the picture that we take, the selfie
Sure.
that's on the peak. So talk to me about how that is for you. Have you ever had a similar transition in your life where, it's the reality of like, okay, what does my life feel like on the inside versus what it looks like from the outside, working towards goals and achievements and accomplishments?
Certainly, and in many respects, a lot of that comes back to Tristan's death. So, I mean, my wife is an avid photographer, if you will, and she takes tens of thousands of pictures. And as we were piecing all of those moments together for Tristan's celebration of life, you look back and you see all these wonderful, happy moments, and you realize behind the scenes, a lot of times there were other issues going on. Kids didn't want to be in the pictures, or we didn't want to. We didn't want to be where we were at that particular moment in time. But there's always smiles and joy and happiness for the camera to portray outwardly that we really are in this happy place. And I think so many of us wear masks throughout the day, and certainly in the days, weeks, and months following Tristan's death, our family portrayed this mask, and we were still able to smile at the appropriate times and attend the appropriate functions, but that's not what we were feeling inside, and right. It's starting to slowly morph. But one of the things there is you think that life is going a certain way, and the inevitability of all life is death. But you always assume there's a certain order to things. The universe has a certain balance to it. And when you lose a child, that order is completely and irrevocably impacted, and it'll never be in balance again. So, with respect to, reaching out on social media, so I actually did a Facebook post. I've done a number of Facebook posts. One was a message to graduates. It was the message the year after the next graduation, the message I would have delivered to Tristan if I'd had the foresight to do so. And it was really about, understanding that failure is also inevitable, just as death is, and we should embrace failure and not shy away from it and not be scared of it, because ultimately failure is a path towards success. And if we don't have those failures, then we never have perspective. It's like trying to understand love without hate and joy without, great tragedy. All those things, the yin and the yang, understanding that balance and perspective are important. Otherwise, we don't have any basis of comparison. So, I started out pumping gas when I was 14. And here I am now. I'm running for district attorney. So I've done a number of things in between. I was a software engineer, all these things. But I've also had failures. I've had, tons of failures, hundreds of failures. I fail at things every day. But that's okay, and it's okay to accept it. And we can't always portray that, my life is happy and great and everything is just wonderful, and I love who I am and who I'm with and all these exceptional things, which is not, in almost any respect, the reality that we live within. So understanding that there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be downfalls, there's going to be tragedy. It's inevitable. It's the human condition. People will die out of order. We will experience these horrific events throughout our lives, or know people that have experienced them, and will somehow be touched by those. And realizing that we can move forward, we can move on, but they become part of who we are. And I wouldn't be here today if not for everything in the path that I had undertaken. So I think it's important to understand that, we may portray outwardly these great visions of the wonderment of our lives, but knowing that inwardly, many of us are suffering, but we can project that too. So in some of my Facebook posts that I did, I guess, kind of as a therapy for myself. I never went to any support groups or anything like that. I kind of turned to writing to kind of express some of my emotions. And obviously I held a lot of that back because some of the writing would have been a little bit dark in the intervening years and months. But it was a way to express and to help others to try to connect, to see what the journey could look like, and to know that even if you've experienced something horrific, the world continues to turn, the sun continues to shine, the seasons continue to change, we continue to move on, and we continue to try to give back and do something important to help others.
Yeah. Yes, there is this need in the world today, I truly believe, to be more vulnerable in sharing that real human experience, to allow ourselves to fail forward. When we're teaching our kids about, Thomas Edison, it shouldn't just be that he invented the light bulb. It's, the 42 times or however many it was that he failed before he actually discovered how it really worked. So I'm grateful for that message. Thank you. And I suspect that all of this continues to play into that concept that we started to talk about, which is legacy. If you could fast forward, 100 years from now, and someone were to say, oh my gosh, of course that happens to me, and someone were to say, who was Christopher Folk? What is the legacy that you hope to be known for?
Ideally, I don't think I want people to remember me so much as what I've done and the impact I've had. So I'm perfectly fine if 100 years from now my name is completely forgotten and it's not etched in any history book anywhere. But that I've done something to help my community, to help raise awareness for this tragedy that is suicide, that I've helped to bring people together so that people understand that we are really connected. And even in this world of social media, where we look connected but we truly aren't, that we depend on one another and we need these interactions, we need the communication. The relationships really are key. And I would hope that I can make some small incremental changes, and the effects, the resulting effects of those changes will continue to be felt many years from now, long after my name is gone and no longer uttered on the lips of anyone. And I'd hope to make, as cliche as it sounds, but to try to make the world a slightly better place than that within which I was born. So, losing a child, you think as a parent, your ultimate responsibility is the safety and protection of your children. So when you've lost a child, you almost feel like there's a debt that you owe to the universe. So I just want to try to repay part of that in the short time I have remaining here.
Thank you. I think of this quote from Helen Keller, and I'll paraphrase, but to the effect that no one need wait a single moment before we begin to improve the world, right? It's in all of these choices, these days, these moments, these decisions, in how we move forward, that we choose into the ability to impact others, to improve the world around us. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And before we head out here, I would love it if we share just a little bit of wisdom with our viewers. If there is a particular song or a quote or just an expression that inspires you on a daily basis that we could leave our viewers with today.
Well, it's kind of a bit of a take on the golden rule, if you will. So, the typical do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When I think back to my children and Tristan in particular, he was always of the view that you should do unto others above and beyond what you'd want them to do unto you. And I think instead of looking at things from a reciprocity standpoint, we should look, how can we make someone else's life better? What little incremental thing can we do on a daily basis, which might be almost inconsequential to us, but could have a lasting impact on them? I mean, you think you're walking on the sidewalk, you pass someone, you utter a hello, which would have been typical 25 years ago, but is far less today, it would seem. We tend to look down at our screens, but put those away and become engaged and actually make an effort to bring a smile to someone's face. You never know what is going on behind the scenes with them. You never know what they're facing on a daily or a minute-by-minute basis. So if you can do something small to make them feel somewhat better, even for a brief time, then I think that elevates yourself and it elevates others as well.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's such a great reminder. So for everyone who is watching, this is Christopher Folk, who is currently running for district attorney, and hopefully everyone who's watching will get out and vote. But we just left you with something that I hope you'll ponder and perhaps put into practice in your life, which is to think about how you can add value to anyone and to everyone around you at any moment in time. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, for watching. Thank you, Christopher, for being part of today's show.
Happy to be here.
Yes. And we'll see you next month.